Good morning. My name is Joyce Armstrong, and the gospel lesson today is from Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 43. He, Jesus, put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, the seeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done it." The slaves said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first, bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Jesus told the crowd all these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. "I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world." Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And the disciples approached him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." And he answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin, all evildoers, and they will be thrown into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen." The gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Well, grace and peace to all of you from God, who is our Father, and from Jesus Christ. Amen. As we go through Matthew's gospel, it is important to remember that the writer is writing for a specific Jewish Christian community within the first 100 years after Christ. They are particularly concerned with how the law, what they know as Jewish people, fits into Jesus' life as they are now Christians. Not only Jesus' life, but his death and resurrection, and what it means to be right with God. In Matthew's gospel, we get more of what sounds like Jesus making clear distinctions about good people going to heaven and bad people going to hell. For us reading today, 2,000 years later, it is important for us to really think about what these kinds of statements, especially in light of Jesus' larger story, mean. This is important because when I read the parable of the weeds and the wheat that we just heard, sometimes I feel really uncomfortable because I can then use them to condemn certain people in my mind, you know? And just last week, we heard that we are not to look around at each other and judge who is in and who is out, remember? But most of the time, I feel really uncomfortable about this parable because it makes me wonder if I am a weed. I mean, I like to think I'm a pretty decent person most of the time, but I have my moments when I react in anger or unkind ways, when I don't stop to help someone when I should, when I get scared and put my trust in my savings account instead of in God, when I speak unkindly about someone, when I don't care enough for the environmental creation that God made. The list could go on. I am in bondage to sin and cannot free myself. Or as St. Paul puts it, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. If I am to determine if I am weeds or wheat by how well I follow the laws all the time, I think I might be in trouble. I mean, what is the line that you're not supposed to cross? Or what is the number of sins committed that turn you into weeds? I can tell myself that it's a matter of the heart, and that I'm trying my best. Meanwhile, others out there seem to be rotten on the inside, so they rarely act out of anything that resembles love. They're the ones in trouble. But there I go judging again, right? Which I'm not supposed to do, so I'm back at square one again. God's law is, in fact, a gift to us, to set us on the right path, to know that we are we're supposed to be trying to do our best to love God and love each other, that's the direction we're supposed to be following. But the law also always condemns us. It also acts like a mirror to show us that we don't follow the law, that we always do fall short. When it's spelled out so specifically for us, we can see all the ways that we are not living up to the law. And don't think that Jesus makes the law any easier for us. Read through the 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount. It's full of impossible, hyperbolic expectations. I'm not sure if Jesus is so frustrated at the lack of love for their neighbors that he is trying to say these extreme things to wake them up, or if he is being so extreme in his statements to show everyone that no one is in a right relationship with God and each other, that all of us have a little weeds in us. Whichever the case, it's not looking great that anyone is going to end up being wheat. If all we had was a few chapters of Matthew, the gospel wouldn't feel like good news. This is why we go back to my original assertion that we need to read this parable in the context of the larger story. We can look at the much larger story of God's relationship with us in the entire Bible and see that in the beginning, God created us to be good and in God's image in order to be in a loving relationship with God and each other. And this is reflected in our parable for today as well. And as we continue reading through the Old Testament, we see how God has struggled over and over with what to do with this evil and suffering in our world, what to do with us, a humanity that has all fallen short of the glory of God, a humanity full of weeds and wheat. If we were to look at the characters of the Old Testament, who God loved and worked through, it would really mess with our sense of who is weeds and who is wheat. Abraham didn't trust God's promise about having a child and ended up sleeping with his wife's younger servant so that he could have a child through her. Then, when Sarah did have a baby, they sent that servant and the child away, and they would have died out in the desert if it wasn't for God's help. Jacob was kind of a moral catastrophe right from the beginning to the end. There's a lot going on there. King David had an affair with a married woman, and then when she got pregnant, had her husband killed to try to cover it up. And these were the good guys, and this is just the beginning of the list. Then we see in the Christmas stories of Luke and Matthew that God decided to do something new, that God decided to become human and live among us, teaching us how to love and showing us what that looks like. As we think about the parable of the wheat and the weeds and what it means, it's important to remember the kinds of people that Jesus hung out with all the time. He got in trouble from the religious leaders for eating and drinking with people they considered to be weeds. weeds among their own Jewish people, but also weeds of the world. In other words, anyone who wasn't Jewish, or even worse, Samaritans. There was even a time when he got in trouble from a guy who was hosting him for dinner because he was letting a particular woman of ill repute clean his feet. He was notorious for widening his circle of belonging, calling people wheat who others called weeds. St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, has a lot to say about weeds and wheat as well. He says in chapter 5 that Christ died for us even when we were still sinners, even as we lived as weeds. On the cross, Jesus forgives a thief next to him who asks for forgiveness at the 11th hour. And many are pretty skeptical about how penitential he really was versus how much he was just trying to give it a shot, right? What does he have to lose? And not only did Jesus forgive him and promise him the kingdom of God, he also prays to God to forgive even those who put him on the cross, even though they hadn't even asked for forgiveness. So I wonder about the parable of the weeds and the wheat, not to dismiss it, but to look at it in a way that maybe makes more sense in the larger story. Throughout the Old Testament, images of fire and being thrown into the fire is often associated with refining, of purifying and getting rid of all the bad stuff so that only the good stuff remains. The fact that this process can only be done in the end explains why there is so much weeds among the wheat in our world today. Acknowledging that God knows our struggle and that an evil force is at work in our world today that holds us back from loving God and loving each other in the way we were created to do. That God doesn't create the suffering, but God sees it, is working among us today, and has a plan for what to do about it when the time is right. That in the end, we'll probably all be thrown into that refiner's fire, and the evil parts of us will be burned away, and we are left the way God originally made us, pure and whole, healed, and full of love. Perhaps given all this, we can hear this parable with hope. Hope for ourselves, hope for our loved ones, hope that in this world that is filled with wheat and weeds, inside us and all around us, God will not leave us in this condition. That someday God will bring an end to the brokenness and we will all be healed and whole. As Martin Luther realized, Jesus is not the jailer, keeping us locked away in fear. He's the one who frees us. Or as John's gospel says, Jesus did not come into this world to condemn the world, but so that the world would be saved through him. We've all got some weeds in us. But through Jesus' death and resurrection, we are made into wheat. We are sinners who are declared by God to be saints, not because we are perfect, but that no matter what happens in our lives, God will always still call us beloved children. And so thanks be to God. Amen.